The war has not started last February 24th, but actually it has started now 9 years ago.
There is really only one solution to achieve peace, and that is to defeat the Russian military.
Putin is clearly banking on divisions within Europe as his primary strategy.
One tool that we have are, of course, UN peace operations.
The only way to ensure peace in the entire region and not only in Ukraine is to provide Ukraine with the strongest security guarantees. And the only strong security guarantee that we can legitimately rely on is, of course, NATO membership.
Europeans can't give up on supporting Ukraine. They can't watch a European nation be destroyed.
One thing actually is to discuss how to achieve peace, but also to look at what is coming next. How can we make peace sustainable? I think the Secretary General Stoltenberg really stressed several times in his intervention that the war has not started last February 24th, but actually it has started now 9 years ago. It will be certainly very difficult and challenging to maintain peace, sustain peace. It's also, and I think it was stressed by Deputy Secretary General Michel Genoa to say that, there are lots of, in a way, not obstacles, but it's very difficult to discuss about peace and the future in Ukraine when we don't even know when and how peace will be looking like.
There is really only one solution to achieve peace, and that is to defeat the Russian military. I think it was the Swedish foreign minister in Kyiv this morning who said only military defeat of Russia can solve this conflict. Chairman Milley of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States has said a similar thing. And I think that when we look for peace and to define what that long-lasting peace means, I think we look to President Zelensky's 10 principles that he presented at the G20 meeting. First, there needs to be nuclear safety. That means removing all troops from the nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia, as well as stopping all of the threats to use nuclear weapons. Second, there has to be food security for the world. These are steps that if you take them, you can build to peace, and they are easy to be taken. Food security means allowing for exports of grain through all of the ports in Ukraine. Third would be energy security. We need to stop these massive strikes. As you know, on November 23rd, there were some 67 cruise missiles fired at the electricity system, water, and power transmission systems in Ukraine. Over 40% of the system is damaged. At times, the entire country was under a blackout. They have to stop bombing the civilian infrastructure of the country as the third point. Fourth, return Ukraine's prisoners and return the forced deportees. Some 11,000 children are known by name to be forcibly deported to Russia. And we need to return all of these people for there to be peace. Fifth, and this gets to the question that you discussed in the introduction, there needs to be abidance with international rule of law, which means the UN Charter and the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine need to be reestablished. Our territorial integrity is critical. Sixth, of course, all Russian troops and all of Russian militias and Wagner groups and mercenaries need to be removed from the territory of Ukraine. Seventh, we need to have justice. We need to establish that special tribunal that was approved by a UN General Assembly vote. Eighth, and I think this is something we don't talk enough about, protection of the environment. There are tens of thousands of hectares that have been mined. This is the future of safety for the people of Ukraine, agriculture and farming, and so much more. The environmental devastation needs to end, and we'll need more resources in order to remove those mines. Ninth, we need to prevent any future escalation, and that has to do with the Security Compact. The Kyiv Security Compact proposal, which Ukraine has developed together with former Secretary General Rasmussen, very clearly outlines what those steps need to be to assure that there is no future escalation, future rebuilding of that Russian military after its defeat. And then finally, at the end, you can confirm the end of the war. You can sit down and you can sign documents, but no documents can be signed, no agreements can be reached until there's good faith effort to meet these principles, because there is no trust and can be no trust with Russia, which is illegally in an unprovoked way invaded the country and used some, I don't remember it, I think the defense minister said today, 16,000 missiles against primarily 97% civilian infrastructure. So for there to be peace, you need to build trust. And those steps, implementing them one by one, can build the trust that can lead to a peace where Ukraine's borders are secure, where the world no longer need be concerned about future escalation. I'll end there. Thank you.
It's slightly invidious, I think, for all of us trying to imagine a peace at the moment when we are frankly still very far away from a peace, and there are so many movable parts in this war that it's very difficult to predict how the next 6 months is going to go, let alone anything beyond that. Even as we speak, the Ukrainians are engaged in an intense offensive against Kremina, whilst just a little further down the road, the Russians are engaged in an intense offensive against Bakhmut. And if either of those towns were to fall in the next couple of weeks or so, it would have a very significant effect on the tactical strategic position. We have an I think almost unprecedented situation, certainly much more intense than the other war that I covered, the wars in the former Yugoslavia, of the use of artillery, the amount of artillery, the number of shells that are being fired every day. And now actually, this is creating a problem both for Ukraine supporters, the allies in the West, in terms of actually supplying the munitions that they require, particularly since you have often a disjuncture in the type of weapons that the Ukrainians are using, former Soviet weapons, and so the West doesn't produce the right size ammunitions for them. And Russia too is hurling so many missiles, as Natalie pointed out, largely at civilian infrastructures, but on the battlefields against the military as well, that Russia too is having supply problems, and yet there's no sign at the moment of the intensity of the war dying out. Then you have the international aspects where Putin is clearly banking on divisions within Europe as his primary strategy, above all else in Germany, but also he will have noted the divisions in the Czech Republic, in Italy, as to whether the European populations, we know that the Ukrainian population is going to sustain their morale for a long time, notwithstanding the terrible strategy that Putin has unleashed on them with the attacks on the civilian infrastructure and the power grid above all else. But how long are the European populations going to back support for Ukraine? We simply don't know, but we do know that there is a significant part, for example, of the German population which questions this whole strategy. Similarly, China clearly does not want Russia to pull it into a major confrontation with the Western powers, which is not of China's choosing, either the time or the place or the nature of it. And here, incidentally, I'd like to point out one good thing that has happened, and that is it has become clear that over the past few months, if not weeks, China and the United States have been engaged in back-channel discussions to ensure that this war does not escalate to nuclear, and that is a really good thing in my opinion. China has also expressed its dissatisfaction with Putin. Putin has lost the support of large parts of Central Asian countries who have expressed their dissatisfaction. But Putin continues to enjoy support in critical areas in Africa and in South America and in parts of Asia as well. So this is playing out on the battlefield. It's playing out on the level of the suffering of the Ukrainian people. It's obvious what is going to have to happen in Ukraine. Natalie has spelt it out very clearly in terms of issues like justice and so on, the reconstruction of Ukraine, which we know is going to cost a fortune. That will have to happen, and we will all have to put our shoulder to the wheel.
I would like to address this question of trust and what are the tools we have as an international community in order to build that trust and to come to a certain peace, however we define that peace. And that's, I think, also a question: how do we define peace and stability for that matter? And one tool that we have are, of course, UN peace operations. And UN peace operations were meant and were created to help state quell conflict, resolve dissensions, and of course protect civilians. And the questions of peacekeeping resurface, of course, with the war in Ukraine. In March, Poland suggested that it might be a good idea to have NATO deploy a mission in Ukraine in order to provide security. That proposition was then followed by the USCE, who suggested to also oversee a mission in Ukraine in order to help the population. And of course, then the question was raised, well, what about the United Nations? What about a peacekeeping missions? And when we talk about the UN, of course, one of the biggest advantage, or what is different about the UN, is that it regroups all the countries in the world. So by definition, by its very nature, the organization is international and hence can be seen as more impartial. The question then is, what type of peacekeeping missions would we see? Who would be involved? Which member states? How would it come forward, and which means would be deployed in order to carry on a peacekeeping mission? And as a Canadian, I put forward a proposition of a peacekeeping operations à la Suez. And what I mean by that is, of course, we've seen mostly in the 1990s and in the year 2000, mostly big peacekeeping operations, multi-dimensional missions that really aimed at quelling conflict within states. It's been, since the 1950s, we've rarely seen, or we've never seen, conflict between member states that included one permanent member against another. So the question of à la Suez refers, of course, to the UN missions, the United Nations Emergency Force that happened in Egypt in 1956, and that followed the idea of the former Canadian minister, Lester B. Pearson, who put forward this idea of deploying troops under the banner of the United Nations in order to supervise the withdrawal of France, UK, and Israel forces from Egyptian territories, and once the withdrawal would be done, to act as a buffer and, of course, to supervise the cessation of hostilities. There are two advantages, I think, to a mission of interposition like this. First of all, in the very idea of crafting, designing a mission that opens a new forum, a new area of negotiations between the permanent members, which, as you know, are the UK, China, Russia, France, and the United Nations. So it opens a new forum of discussion in agreeing on something, on doing something. And of course, the second advantage is that if a peacekeeping mission is indeed put forward, then of course it can help contain the conflict at the international level, certainly at the regional level, and alleviate the suffering of the population. But when I say à la Suez, I also refer to the role that Canada could have. And Canada, as a non-European mission, the founder of Blue Helmets, if I may say, with a significant Ukrainian diaspora that speaks the language, that know the territory, could have a key role. And this is the more current that the president of Ukraine actually called Canada for their help for a long-term peace plan on November 17 at the Halifax Security Conference. And I think that Canada could play a significant role in such a peacekeeping mission that, akin to the UNEF, so the United Nations Emergency Force that happened in 1956. Now, this one would be in Ukraine and could indeed supervise the withdrawal of forces and create and supervise the cessation of hostilities, act as a buffer as well. But of course, this would need to be revisited because, as we all know, the situation from 1950s has changed a lot. The technology has changed a lot as well. So there are many remaining questions. So, for example, what would be a buffer zone? What would we be supervising? Are we talking about a truce, a ceasefire, a full peacekeeping agreement or a peace agreement? And what does it entail in terms of monitoring, but also of different consequences? It's been mentioned that territories have been mined. We all know about the drones. Could we mobilize new technologies now to act as a buffer zone, maybe using cyberspace, satellites? So all of these questions stay there. But I think just the very drafting of any type of agreement or any missions would have this added value of starting a new space of negotiation between the member states, and that's something to be revisited. Thank you.
I will actually start by bringing in the Sarah's points about the peacekeeping and connect them with the reflections that were already made throughout this conference in the earlier sessions as well. And the reflection is that Western-led ideas and institutions how to deal with peace or conflict elsewhere have largely failed. We have failed in our belief that trade and closer economic relations will ensure peace between countries, and that's why also there's no belief on either side of the participants in this conflict that peacekeeping is a solution. Sarah already pointed out that the offers were rejected, but also there is increasing understanding that a premature peace, and currently any peace that can be reached will be premature because both sides are unhappy and think that they can do more on the battlefield. This premature peace would be even worse than the current unpeace and the state of war that we have on the battlefield. In this regard, I absolutely agree with Natalie that peace will have to be won on the battlefield, and for that Ukraine needs to advance much more in deoccupying its territory. But I already said that actually, whatever happens, very likely that both sides will still be unhappy, which means that we'll probably be in this, if we're lucky, stable situation of unpeace, of pre-war, and if we're unlucky, in the kind of war-type situation for quite some time to come. Ukraine will be inherently unhappy if it doesn't deoccupy all the territories that it has, and Russia will be very unhappy with the undeniable defeat. And it's very unlikely that Russia is just going to be sulking quietly in its corner. Russia will, under the current regime, will think about satisfying its ambition, if not in Ukraine, then potentially in countries like Georgia, Moldova, or Belarus. That's why it will definitely be a long story, and indeed I agree absolutely that maintaining peace will be much more difficult and much more long-term mission than even getting to peace. In terms of maintaining peace and how to keep at least some countries, participants of this conflict, happy, Natalie outlined a fantastic list of preconditions that need to be met. Largely, of course, being representative of an organization that's located in Eastern Europe, we strongly believe that the only way to ensure peace in the entire region, and not only in Ukraine, is to provide Ukraine with the strongest security guarantees. And the only strong security guarantee that we can legitimately rely on is, of course, NATO membership. It is not going to come anytime soon, not in the immediate years, but it is fair enough and actually in our own benefit to make sure that we strive for this ambition. Before that comes and before it can become possible, Europeans will try to do everything possible to include Ukrainians into as many economic and societal structures as possible to make sure that if the time comes, Ukraine will also be ready to join the security arrangements in Europe.
Thank you so much, and thank you, all of you, for your input to this issue. I want to step back for a moment and just say that peace requires military defeat, or there is no peace. A ceasefire is not peace with Russia. We've had a ceasefire for 8 years. I was minister when this war began. It led to further invasion. And peace does not alleviate suffering if a portion of the Ukrainian population remains under Russian occupation. Remember that every town that's been liberated, we unfortunately see after the high and after the wonderful news of a town being liberated, all of the tremendous evil and destruction, torture that goes on behind that wall of occupation. This is an attempt to destroy a complete society. It is an attempt to commit genocide and eliminate Ukrainians. So, to one of the speaker's points, Europeans can't give up on supporting Ukraine. They can't watch a European nation be destroyed. We've seen this before in history. We've seen a people being destroyed, and we reacted too late. We need to do everything we can to support military defeat of Russia in order to gain peace. And to the extent that Ukrainians are making the vast majority, I mean 99.9% of the contribution to defending the peace and freedom of Europe, whether that's at the front, whether that's freezing in their apartments with no water in minus 10 degrees, 20 degrees centigrade. Europeans, democracies globally need to continue to support Ukraine. So I would urge not to look at a peacekeeping mission until at least some of those steps that I described to you have already been employed, so that we have some path to building trust. Trust that everyone mentioned is critical to any peace. But I just want to underline again before we move on that there really is no peace and there is no sustainable peace that was described unless the military is defeated. The Russian military must be defeated. And so what that means is right now, support for Ukraine means more weapons. It means more air support, air defense. It means financial support to maintain critical government services. And now, because of the last weeks of carpet bombing the electricity and power system, it means helping support restoration of power throughout the country. I was in the US administration when the Soviet Union was collapsing, and the George Bush Sr. administration at the time was also terribly concerned about the Soviet Union's collapse and what would happen to the nuclear weapons. And so this concern is not new, and yet we've gotten through it. So I urge everyone not to base our attempts to support Ukraine and achieving defeat on what will happen in Russia. I think that has to be something that is secondary to bringing a military defeat first. I think practically what happens with Russia will, to a large extent, depend on how we as democratic countries have come to support Ukraine, strengthen the region, meaning Moldova as well, strengthened our NATO forces, and what we've created in the interim during this horrific war in terms of strength, which will then, I think, define whether or not Russia continues to be an imperialistic and militaristic state or not. And so I think that the security guarantees, the bilateral and multilateral security guarantees that are built as we seek peace, I think how we invest in the rebuilding of Ukraine and strengthening Ukraine post or even now as we move through this war towards a eventual and necessary peace, I think are going to be very, very important criteria for defining what Russia will or will not do after its defeat. But I think we need to focus right now, because the number of people that are dying and the way these people are dying at the targeting of the civilian infrastructure and the targeting of civilians is something that we need to put an end to as democracies globally, not just for Ukraine, but for ourselves and for the future of democracy globally. Thank you.